My son once sent me a message that cut straight through me. He wrote, "I'd rather lose my mother than lose my wife." 3 days before that, she had thrown me to the ground, wrenching my shoulder and leaving a gash across my face. He didn't say a word about it, and I didn't either, not until his name quietly vanished from the estate papers. $12 million and 800 acres. Then came the dinner invitation. They walked in smiling as though nothing had happened. I stayed quiet, but when I didn't bend to their unspoken demands, she tipped a ladle of soup over my head. He gripped my throat, struck me across the face, and disowned me under my own roof. And just as I staggered back, the front door flew open. Tell me, what kind of justice exists when your own child turns against you? It was a Thursday evening at my house, my table. I had baked cornbread, roasted a chicken, and set out butter the way Jared liked it when he was 10. I only wanted a simple family meal, something ordinary, something that might smooth the rough waters. I told myself maybe Fiona had settled down. Maybe I could lower my guard for once. She arrived in 4-inch heels and an off-the-shoulder dress, as if she were heading to a cocktail party. Jared trailed behind her, wearing that uneasy smile of a man trying not to get caught. He handed me a bottle of wine I hadn't asked for, kissed my cheek, and asked if dinner was ready. We sat down, but the air was stiff from the start. Fiona poked at her food and tapped her fork against the plate like she couldn't wait to be done. Jared kept glancing at his phone every few seconds. I tried to keep the conversation light. I asked about the garden they claimed they were planting, mentioned a book I had finished. Nothing landed. Fiona finally shoved her plate aside, leaned back, and asked, "Do you ever stop controlling everything?" My hand froze halfway to my glass. I set it down and told her I didn't understand. She gave a cold laugh. She said I micromanaged the house, the land, even Jared's eating habits, as if all of it were my little kingdom. I looked at Jared, hoping for some defense, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I steadied my voice and reminded her this was still my home, and I had every right to extend kindness in whatever way I chose. She smirked, lifted her glass, and said, "You want kind." Then she hurled the wine into my face. It soaked my blouse and stung my eyes. I gasped and reached for a napkin. Before I could wipe my chin, Jared's chair scraped back. The slap came hard and sudden, his palm against my cheek. The same hand that once clutched mine crossing parking lots now struck me without hesitation. "Stop," he said. "You're ruining everything." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stood, wine dripping from my jaw, and walked out of the room. Fiona's laughter echoed behind me. Jared didn't follow. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked older than it had that morning. The redness on my cheek was spreading. I washed in silence, not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing left to say. That night, the message arrived 10 words, one sentence, sharp as a blade. "I'd rather lose my mother than lose my wife." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into nothing. After a long while, I opened the drawer and pulled out the estate binder, page by page. I studied it. The land, the trust, the pending transfers. Jared's name was everywhere, but nothing had been finalized. I closed the binder and let its weight settle on my lap. I don't know what other mothers would have done. Begged, waited, forgiven. But I knew one thing for certain: I had been struck for the last time. And something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to plead for love anymore. I was going to stand untouchable, If you've ever been treated like an inconvenience in your own home, you'll understand. That night was the last time I let someone else decide my worth. And the first time I remembered who I truly was. The next morning I woke at 5. My cheek was still tender from the slap, but I didn't bother looking in the mirror. I already knew what I would see. I walked past the kitchen without making coffee and went straight to the storage room at the back of the house. That room hadn't changed in years, the same old file cabinet, the same tin box of useless keys, dust along every shelf. I unlocked the second drawer, slid it open, and pulled out the black binder that held my entire estate plan. It was thick, heavy, marked in my own handwriting. I carried it to the dining table and sat down in Jared's usual seat. One by one, I flipped through the pages. The land, 800 acres still under my name. The trusts, the retirement funds, the property taxes. Jared's name sat beside line after line marked pending beneficiary. Some forms had signatures, but none had been filed with the county. Near the back I found the transfer packet, tucked in a yellow folder, unsigned, still mine. I closed the binder and left it on the table, sitting there for several minutes in silence, not hesitating, not second-guessing, just letting the quiet soak through me. Then I stood, picked up the landline, and dialed the one number I hadn't called in years. On the second ring, Jude Watkins answered. I remembered him as the sharp young associate at my husband's old law firm, reserved, efficient, with just enough coldness to keep people honest. Now he ran his own practice. I told him I needed to revise my estate immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. He didn't ask questions. He simply gave me a time, 10:15. I arrived at his office by 10. The building sat above a dentist's clinic, quiet as a library. No receptionist, no music, just clean walls and a steady ticking clock. He opened the door himself, wearing the same square glasses, still carrying the air of a man who could cut someone down with 3 calm sentences. I handed him the binder, pointed to the flag tabs, and said every page with Jared's name had to be removed or frozen. He nodded and began reading. For half an hour he said almost nothing, only flipping pages and scribbling notes. Finally, he shut the binder, leaned back, and looked at me. It's all yours, he said. Every signature belongs to you. Nothing has been filed. Nothing's binding. We can pull it all back. I asked him what the steps were. Step 1. Revoke the transfer intentions in writing. Step 2. Add protective clauses to block any future claims. Step 3. Designate new beneficiaries immediately. I told him to do all 3. He promised to have the documents ready before lunch. I left his office with a copy of the revocation letter in my bag and a strange calm sitting in my chest. Back home, I didn't eat. I didn't turn on the TV. I cleared the dining table and opened the binder again. Every page with Jared's name stared back at me like a map of betrayal. I laid them out flat across the table, one by one. Then I gathered them, sealed them inside a new envelope, and wrote across the front in thick black ink, void, not filed. Do not process. I set it next to the fireplace. By 3 o'clock, Jude had emailed me the first draft of the new estate plan. The file name read, Winslow Restatement Final. No version 1, no draft 2, just final. I printed the pages slowly, stacked them into a fresh folder, and called a notary service. They said someone could come at 6. At 6:05, A woman in a gray blazer stepped into my living room with a clipboard. I signed every line without a moment's pause. She notarized, packed her bag, and left in less than 20 minutes. When the door closed, I sat back at the table. The air in the house felt different, lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. I reached for the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the pages that once promised family legacy. I struck a match, touched it to the corner, and dropped the paper into the fireplace. The flames curled the edges, blackened the lines, erased the names. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was removal. There are moments when a woman sees her name on a document and realizes she still owns everything that matters. That was the night I stopped being a mother begging for affection. That was the night I became a woman reclaiming peace. By Saturday morning, the new plan was signed, notarized, and locked in my study drawer. Jared's name no longer appeared on a single asset, no land, no house, no accounts, not even the vehicles. He wasn't simply removed. He was erased, and the silence in my house didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I woke before dawn, drove the truck to the gas station, filled the tank, and picked up the local paper. At the bottom of the front page, beneath a tiny story about a high school fundraiser, was the announcement I had submitted 2 days earlier. Loretta Winslow, longtime resident of Green Hollow County and former U.S. Army nurse, has established the Winslow Foundation for Veterans and Women in Crisis. It read that $10 million from my estate had been committed to fund programs across the Tri-County area. I read the paragraph twice, folded the paper neatly, and laid it in the passenger seat. A small story, yes, but it was enough. On the way home, I pulled into the church lot. The place was empty except for Pastor Elgin's old truck parked around back. I knew he'd be inside, the way he always was on Saturdays. I didn't go in. I just sat in the cab, engine off, looking at the windows I had scrubbed for years. There was no fear in me, no hesitation, only a deep steadiness. It wasn't vengeance. It was correction. Back at the house, I watered the herbs on the kitchen sill, fed the dogs, and waited. By mid-afternoon, my phone lit up with Jared's name. I let it ring. 20 minutes later, he called again. I silenced it. At 5:42, a text came through. We saw the paper. Can we come over to talk? I didn't answer. At 6:18, the gate camera buzzed. Headlights filled the drive. Jared's car. I dried my hands at the sink and opened the front door as they were walking up the steps. Fiona wore a pale green coat and heels that clicked like she was daring the ground to challenge her. Jared trailed behind, his head lowered. Fiona greeted me with a smile, her voice dripping with sugar that never reached her eyes. I didn't return it. I simply stepped aside and let them in. We sat at the same dining table where the slap had landed weeks earlier. I hadn't changed the chairs. I wanted the memory to remain. Fiona began with compliments, calling the donation generous, inspiring, a gift to the community. Her tone was syrupy, the kind people use before they ask for something. Jared kept quiet. Then came the shift. Fiona leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She asked whether the donation had been filed formally. She hinted there might still be time to adjust certain details. She suggested Jared could help manage the foundation, that keeping it in the family would preserve the legacy. I let her finish without a blink. Then I stood, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and came back. I looked her straight in the eye. No, I said, it's done. Her smile cracked. Not much, just enough to show the truth. Fiona's nails tapped against the wood, sharp and steady, as if she could wear me down with sound alone. When she saw I wouldn't budge, her voice rose. She accused me of being selfish, of wasting the family's future on strangers. Jared shifted in his chair, his shoulders caving as though he'd rehearsed silence. I told her calmly the land was mine, the money was mine, and the choice was mine. That was when she reached for the ladle. She dipped it into the pot of chicken stew still steaming in the center of the table and tipped it over my head. The broth ran down my scalp, burning hot, dripping onto my sweater, staining the tablecloth. For a moment, the room went still except for the hiss of liquid hitting wood. I pushed back my chair slowly, but before I could rise, Jared's hand clamped around my throat. His grip was strong, the way it had been when he was a boy hanging from tree branches, only now it pressed against my windpipe. His other hand struck my cheek, snapping my head to the side. The pain was sharp, but what cut deeper was the look in his eyes, cold, detached, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle. Through the blur of tears, I saw the front door fly open. Ella, my neighbor from 2 doors down, stood there clutching her phone. Her face was pale, her breath quick. "I'm calling the sheriff," she shouted. "Let her go, Jared. Let her go now." Fiona froze, the ladle still dripping onto the rug. Jared released me as though my throat had burned his hand. I staggered back, clutching the edge of the table, coughing. Ella stepped inside, phone pressed to her ear, giving the dispatcher our address, her voice steady and urgent. The room no longer belonged to Jared or Fiona. For the first time in a long time, it belonged to me. The sirens came faster than I expected, cutting through the stillness of the night. Red and blue lights spilled across the walls before the knock rattled the doorframe. Sheriff Daniel stepped inside with 2 deputies at his side. Ella pointed at Jared and Fiona without a word. The stew still stained my sweater, the mark of Jared's hand still hot across my cheek. The deputies moved quickly. One cuffed Jared, the other guided Fiona toward the porch. Fiona sputtered, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that families argued, that I was confused. Jared said nothing. His eyes were blank, his jaw clenched tight as the metal closed around his wrists. The sheriff asked me if I wanted to press charges. My throat was sore, my voice scratchy, but I said yes. Ella's hand squeezed my shoulder, steady as stone. The deputies walked them both to the cruiser, the sound of doors slamming echoing across the yard. Then came silence. Ella stayed a while, made me tea, wiped the stew from the floor, and promised she'd check on me in the morning. After she left, I sat alone in the living room with only the dogs at my feet. The clock ticked past midnight. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the hollow quiet of abandonment. It was the solid quiet of survival. I touched the tender spot on my cheek and thought about every word Jared had said, every choice he had made, and every chance I had given him. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel shame. What I felt was something steadier, something firmer than forgiveness. It was finality. The night air drifted through the open window, cool and clean. For the first time in years, I breathed without fear that someone in my own family would take the air from me. The morning sun slipped through the curtains, soft and steady, as though nothing terrible had ever happened in that room. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook, and began to write. I didn't dress it up, didn't search for polite words. I wrote the truth, line after line, until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred. I wrote about the slap, the ladle of stew, the grip around my throat. I wrote about the message that said he would rather lose me than lose her. And I wrote about the silence after the cruiser pulled away, how it didn't feel empty but earned. When the pages were filled, I closed the notebook and pressed my palm against the cover. That was my record, my proof, not for the courts, not for the neighbors, but for me. By noon, the sheriff had called to confirm charges were filed. He asked if I needed protection. I told him no. The house was enough. The land was enough. I was enough. Then I drove into town with the newspaper folded under my arm. I went straight to the editor's office, laid the clipping on his desk, and told him I wanted the foundation story moved to the Sunday front page. He looked at me over his glasses, surprised. I didn't flinch. It's not just a donation, I said. It's a line drawn. People ought to know where it comes from. He nodded slowly, promised to give it space, and asked if I wanted a photograph. I agreed. That afternoon, a young photographer came out to the farm. He took pictures by the porch, near the fence line, beside the oak tree my husband had planted the year Jared was born. I didn't pose, didn't smile, didn't hide. I just stood as I was, stew-stained sweater, and all the bruise on my cheeks still visible. Because the truth doesn't need polish, it needs light. Sunday morning, I walked down the gravel drive and picked up the paper from the box. The front page carried my name in bold letters, larger than I had ever seen it printed before. Winslow Foundation established. $10 million to veterans and women in crisis. Beneath it was my photograph, the oak tree stretching tall behind me, the bruise on my cheek plain as day. I stood in the yard with the paper open, the cool air brushing against my skin, and let the weight of it settle. For once, the story was told in my words, not theirs. By mid-morning, cars began pulling into the drive. First it was Mrs. Cooper, carrying a basket of biscuits, then Pastor Algan, quiet and red-eyed, though he said little more than a soft "God bless you." The Bennetts stopped by with coffee. Ella came with her daughter, who hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. Each neighbor held the paper, folded or rolled, their fingers still smudged with newsprint. They didn't come for gossip. They came for truth. They told me they had always wondered, always suspected, but had never known how to speak. Now they didn't need to wonder. The proof was in ink. The proof was in me. I poured coffee, set out plates, and filled the table with cornbread and jam. This time, the seats were filled with people who had no stake in my land or my money. They came because they cared, because they understood. The laughter around that table wasn't forced. It wasn't barbed. It was real, and for the first time in years, my house sounded like home. That night, after the last car left and the dishes were stacked by the sink, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. I settled into the rocking chair that had been my husband's, its wood worn smooth by decades of evenings just like this one. The dogs curled at my feet, silent but steady. I looked out over the pasture, where the moonlight touched the tall grass, and thought about the man who had built this life with me. I remembered his laugh, the way he always whistled coming up the drive, the way his hands never hesitated when work was hard. I thought about Jared as a boy, running barefoot across the yard, calling out for me to watch him climb, watch him race, watch him live. Those images still lived inside me, untouched by what had come after. But they didn't sting the way they once did. They felt like photographs I could hold without shaking. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to cry. Not the desperate kind of tears I'd hidden behind locked doors, but the clean kind, the kind that washed instead of burned. I cried for my husband, for the son I used to know, and for the woman I had almost forgotten to be. When the tears dried, I leaned back in the rocker and closed my eyes. The night was quiet, but it wasn't heavy. It was freedom, plain and unadorned, settling over me like a quilt. And in that silence, I whispered to myself the only words that mattered. I'm still here. 2 weeks later, I drove into town and parked in front of the brick building that once held a furniture store. Now a fresh sign hung above the glass door, Winslow Foundation. I stood there for a moment, my reflection caught in the window, older and marked but unbroken. Inside, the air smelled of new paint and clean paper. Folding tables lined the walls, stacked with binders and boxes waiting to be sorted. 3 volunteers, young women I had never met before, were already setting up laptops and arranging chairs. They greeted me with warm smiles, calling me Mrs. Winslow, asking where I wanted things placed. I told them the desks should face the windows so no one would ever feel boxed in. They nodded and got to work, cheerful, determined. I walked the length of the room, running my hand across the smooth tabletops, and felt a kind of quiet pride I hadn't known in years. This place wasn't built for Jared, or for Fiona, or for anyone who thought inheritance was a prize to be stolen. It was built for women who needed shelter, for soldiers who came home with scars nobody could see, for neighbors who had nowhere else to turn. By noon, the first box of donations arrived: blankets, canned food, notebooks, all from people who had read the story in the paper. I helped stack them, my hands steady, my back straight. No one looked at me with pity, they looked at me with respect. And that was worth more than any signature on a deed. When the day wound down, I locked the office door, slipped the key into my pocket, and walked to the truck. The sun was setting, the sky streaked orange and gold, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was walking into something instead of away. That evening I drove home with the key to the foundation still warm in my pocket. The house was quiet when I walked in, the kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, but now felt like rest. I put on a kettle, let the steam rise, and carried a cup of tea into the den. On the top shelf of the bookcase sat the leather-bound album my husband had kept. I pulled it down, brushed the dust from the cover, and opened it on my lap. There we were, frozen in time, his arm around me on our wedding day, Jared bundled in a blanket at the hospital, family picnics beneath the oak. I traced the photos with my fingertips, letting the memories come without flinching. For the first time, I didn't feel the ache of what had been lost. I felt gratitude for what had been real. I lingered on a picture of Jared at 7, dirt on his knees, holding up a frog like it was treasure. I smiled, not because I forgave the man he became, but because I cherished the boy he once was. The album closed with a soft thud, and I set it back on the shelf. The past could live there, safe, no longer clawing at me. I sat in the quiet with my tea cooling in my hands, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not the fragile peace of pretending everything was fine, but the steady peace of knowing I had survived, chosen, and stood firm. And as the last light of day slipped across the floorboards, I knew with certainty I had let go. The next morning, I sat again at the dining table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. This wasn't for lawyers or courts. This was for me. I titled it "My Last Wishes" in my own hand. I wrote that the land, the wide fields, the oak groves, the farmhouse walls that had held both joy and sorrow would pass to the foundation when my time came. Not to Jared, not to Fiona, not to anyone who saw it as courtesy. It would belong to those who needed refuge, who needed soil beneath their feet to remember they were still standing. I wrote that the money, whatever remained, should be used to build housing, to fund scholarships, to feed families who had nowhere else to go. Then I wrote the one sentence that mattered most. This land is not inheritance. It is sanctuary. When I finished, I signed my name, folded the paper, and tucked it into the same drawer that held the notarized documents. I didn't cry, not this time. I felt light, as though the house itself had opened a window. Later, I walked the edge of the pasture, the dogs running ahead, the sky wide and clear. The grass brushed against my palms, and I thought of the generations who had walked here before me. I knew the next footsteps wouldn't be Jared's, and that was no longer a wound. It was a choice. As I turned back toward the house, I whispered the words out loud, letting the wind carry them. It's not theirs to take, it's mine to give. And with that, the story no longer felt like loss. It felt like legacy.